Welcome back. In this video, we would want to look at different annotations which are provided by Spring Boot. What we are doing is we are using example from one of the courses that we created. So in this, we look at all the different annotations that are typically provided by Spring Boot. Let's start with the first one. The first annotation that Spring Boot provides, the most important one, is add Spring Boot application. So add Spring Boot application is basically the first thing you would learn when I start with a Spring Boot application. So if I go to Spring Boot Initializer and create a project, you would see an application class with the annotation at Spring Boot application. So what does at Spring Boot application annotation do? Very simple. What at Spring Boot annotation does is it initializes the Spring framework. So how do you initialize the Spring framework? What does the Spring Boot framework use? An application context. So it needs all the configuration of what packages to scan and all that kind of stuff. So it initializes Spring. That's the first thing that Spring Boot application does. What is the second thing that it does? The second thing it does is it initializes Spring Boot. So it initializes the Spring Boot framework itself. What is the most important feature of Spring Boot framework? It's auto configuration. So basically, Spring Boot application initializes the auto configuration of Spring Boot, and it launches up a simple application context for Spring. Let's look at what is inside it. So let's click there. So Spring Boot application, if I go into the interface, then you can see it. What does it have? It has Spring Boot configuration. It contains enable auto configuration and a component scan. So this is basically the configuration for launching up a Spring Boot context. This is to enable the auto configuration feature of Spring Boot so that all the things that needs to be auto configured are configured. And last but not the least is the add component scan. The add component scan is the one which Spring framework looks for. So where do I need to scan for things? Where do I need to scan for components? That's what the add component scan defines. So over here, add components. So the Spring student application that we are using is present in the package com in 28 minutes Spring Boot. So it automatically adds an add component scan on com in 28 minutes Spring Boot. So all the components, all the repositories, all the controllers, and all the services inside these packages get automatically picked up. So that's basically what the Spring Boot application annotation does. Initializes Spring framework, creates a context, initializes the component scan on the package in which it's present. So it initializes a component scan on this package, so everything inside this package and its sub packages are automatically picked up. The second thing it does is initializes the Spring Boot context, and also the most important feature of Spring Boot, auto configuration. So that's your first annotation, Spring Boot application. Does that end there? Nope. There are other important annotations as well. So I'm going to the Spring controller test. This is a unit test that we are using. Over here, unfortunately, we are not using any of the Spring Boot annotation. So one of the important things over here is the fact that in a unit test, we don't want to launch the entire context. So what we do is we would use a Spring Runner. So we are using Spring Runner to run the test, but we are using at web MVC test. This is to kind of launch only the student controller, the class under test as a specific thing. So in a unit test, one of the Spring Boot annotations that we use is something called at mockbean. If you look at it, this is a part of the package org spring framework.boot. This is used to define a mock bean. So when I say at mock bean on something, what would happen? A mock of this bean would be created and would be auto-wired wherever it's configured to be auto-wired in. So this automatically uses Mockito framework to create an instance, to create a mock of this particular thing, and then you can take it and create mocks around it. So that's kind of a simple mock in a unit test. But the other most important annotation is something called Spring Boot test. So when I want to launch a unit test, so I want to launch an integration test actually. So in an integration test, what would we do? We launch up the entire context. We would launch up the entire Spring Boot application and then hit against it. So if the Spring Boot application is offering services, then we would directly hit the services and see if the data is coming back properly or not. So at Spring Boot test is the thing which is used to launch a Spring Boot context in a test to it you can provide the most important to it you can provide the class. So the Spring Boot application class here is student application.class. So we are providing student application.class, and we are also saying something called random port. So one of the configurations that Spring Boot test supports is that whenever you launch up a Spring Boot application, it can be launched up on any port that you would want. So you can hard code the port, but what would happen is these unit tests would run on, let's say, continuous integration servers, where there would be a lot of other applications which would be running in continuous integration. You don't want one unit test to impact the other, the unit test of one application to impact the other application's unit test. So if you use the random port stuff, then whatever port is available, Spring Boot would use that to launch the application up. So this at SpringBootTest is a cool annotation to launch up integration tests in a Spring Boot kind of an application. And also you have the annotation at local server port. Whatever port that we use or that Spring Boot uses, it would be auto-wired into this port so that we can form the URLs and things like that. So these are kind of the two important annotations in Spring Boot. Spring Boot application is one we looked at. Spring Boot test is the other one. Mockbean is another annotation that is quite cool. There are a lot of other annotations that Spring Boot defines. You can go into the package Spring Boot auto configure. You can go into the jar Spring Boot auto configure 1.4.release. That's the one which we are using right now. So if you go into your Maven dependencies, so if you're using Eclipse and if you have this project set up, then in your Maven dependencies, you can look up all the things that Spring Boot auto configure has. So Spring Boot auto configure here is having all the annotations which are present in here. So you have number of annotations which would be useful for auto configuration, message sources, properties, and things like that. So if you go into specific things, you'd see other stuff as well. But yeah, basically the most important annotations for Spring Boot are Spring Boot application and the Spring Boot test. The other important annotation in Spring Boot test is the Mockbean. So those are the things that we looked at in this specific video. In 28 minutes, our focus is on making you an expert at Spring Boot. We have created a complete website on Spring Boot at www.springbootutorial.com. The link in the description of video would take you to a page where you find details of all the courses, videos, and the articles we have created on Spring Boot. If you love our videos, you'd love our courses too. Our courses have great reviews on Udemy. You can see some of the reviews in here. And there are also articles on basics of Spring Boot, auto configuration, startup projects, startup parent, REST services, web application. All the code examples, we have Maven projects which are present, which you can directly import into Eclipse and start running them, and other references as well. This page would be a great start for you to become an expert on Spring Boot. You might also want to visit our website www.in28minutes.com, all other courses other than Spring Boot as well. Thank you for all the support you are providing us. We would not have grown to 52,000 on Udemy. We would not have such great reviews on courses on Udemy without your support. We would not have been able to grow to 28,000 subscribers and more than 3 million views without your support. We want you to learn and make best use of all the courses that we have. Good luck, and I will see you in the next video or the course. Until next time, here's Ranga from In 28 Minutes signing off.